I'm Elizabeth Shearer. I'm the network coordinator with ClimateWest, and you're here to witness a webinar on the municipal perspective on the value of natural infrastructure. So this webinar will showcase examples of return on investment for natural infrastructure projects in municipalities and discuss options for the cost recovery in these projects. There's been great progress in ecosystem services assessments and natural capital accounting, and we're focusing on what municipalities need, what evidence and numbers they rely on, what tools and planning processes are required to ensure that natural infrastructure is assessed alongside traditional infrastructure for cost effectiveness. The value of natural infrastructure is large and of an emerging and increasing interest. So especially as our communities face changing climate and more frequent extreme weather events. The social benefits simultaneously to the natural benefits result in greater societal return on investment in Canada. There's growing awareness among municipalities of the long-term benefits of natural infrastructure, and efforts are underway to account for natural capital, such as through the Natural Asset Initiative. However, there remains an acute need for standardized processes and approaches to better quantify the value of these systems, as well as more evidence to prioritize natural infrastructure solutions when infrastructure needs arise in both large and small municipalities. It is important for us to make note of the fact that monetary value is not the only value and not the only way to capture value in nature and ecosystems, as multiple worldviews and approaches exist. Indigenous people, for example, have historically viewed nature holistically, emphasizing respect, responsibility, and the reciprocity of relationships between people and nature. In the context of current municipal realities, incorporating the value of nature into the infrastructure planning processes is an important step towards adopting more holistic approaches and the long-term success of our solutions. So, without further ado, I will lead us into an introduction of your hosts for this webinar and a little bit about who we are. So I want to thank IISD for organizing today's webinar and bringing together these three great speakers. This is the second in a series by NIWS, the Natural Infrastructure for Water Solutions, and they have led, which has been led by IISD to help scale up natural infrastructure for cleaner water and more resilient communities across the Prairies region. NIWS aims for natural infrastructure to be backed by evidence, adopted at local scales, financed, and enabled by policy. In the chat, you'll find a code or a link to sign up for the newsletter, and you will also be able to access that by scanning the QR code on the screen. Next, I'd like to make a land acknowledgement for where our work occurs. So the work of ClimateWest and NIWS occurs on traditional lands of Treaties 1 through 8 and 10. This includes many Indigenous nations, and we want to respect and honor Indigenous ways of knowing and beyond, and continue to look forward for ways to weave these knowledges into our climate adaptation work and enable reconciliation on the ground. So this presentation is mostly focused on climate data that is more traditionally in a Western format, and potential future area of work can be incorporating Indigenous knowledge keepers throughout the dissemination of a lot of this important knowledge. So if you do have comments on weaving Indigenous knowledge into ClimateWest work, please feel free to do so. Next, a little bit about ClimateWest. So we are a regional climate service delivery organization. We provide free and reliable climate services to folks all across the Prairie region. We're part of a national network from coast to coast to coast of climate service providers that work in partnership with the Canadian Centre for Climate Services. We are committed to productive collaboration and inclusive decision-making when considering resilience building. A bit more about us is that we are collaborators at heart. We look towards inclusive decision-making when we're working towards resilience building. We share climate information and resources that are reliable, credible, and regionally relevant. As a connector, we link information to action. We connect people to resources, trainings, and a wide network of people working towards climate adaptation. You'll see here a snapshot of some of our knowledge products on our website. You can scan the QR code or visit our website to see any of them. I wanted to make a special shout out to Beyond Climate, which is an introduction to the socioeconomic and ecological data for community adaptation planning in the prairies. This was just published this week, and it aims to help communities identify and find the data relevant to their municipalities. This guide was prepared by IISD. It's a user-friendly, practical tool to help folks access data, reliable resources that are specific to the prairies, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. We, as an organization, advocate and we facilitate and try and translate really complex scientific data to a larger audience. And we do that by participating in webinars like this, meeting folks with where they're at, and developing plans for people to take action on climate change adaptation. Next, I wanted to be able to lift that up in this space by letting you know of two funding opportunities that exist right now for municipalities. The first one is the Climate Ready Plans and Processes. A lot of folks are already aware of this funding stream. They did extend their deadline to December 10th. So if you were thinking it was a tight timeline, please feel free to take this another look and see if you can put in an application before their new deadline. Through the Climate Ready Infrastructure Service, which is a partnership that we have recently taken on with the Canadian Urban Institute, we are working with communities that are under and around 30,000 by matching them with a climate and infrastructure expert on any kind of public infrastructure project. This will allow smaller municipalities to connect with really important expert advice and resources on how they can make their towns, communities, and infrastructure more resilient to climate change and be able to champion climate adaptation in their local community. If you do have an infrastructure project that you're interested in having expert advice on, please check out the website climatereadycanada.ca, and my colleague will be putting it in the chat. There is an official launch happening on December 5th. So we are in this pilot stage of getting an initial network of folks on board leading up to that date, but you can expect to hear more from that after the launch date. This now leads us into our municipal perspective on the value of natural infrastructure. And we have three fantastic presenters with us today. We're going to hear from two municipal infrastructure planners, Robb, the Associate Director of the City of Vancouver Green Infrastructure Implementation Branch, and Graham Watt, a Manager of Strategic Initiatives, Flood Recovery for the City of Grand Forks, who they have made significant advancements in recognizing the value of nature-based infrastructure and implementing these projects for flood mitigation. As municipalities consider approaches and methodologies to formalize value assessments, Michael Kapatanakis, a research analyst with the infrastructure team at IISD, will present the Sustainable Asset Valuation Methodology. And this methodology has been applied globally to assess the costs and benefits of nature-based infrastructure. It'll provide municipalities with a framework to evaluate the costs and benefits of nature-based infrastructure, and it also provides a framework to evaluate the costs, the risks, and benefits associated with these projects. So throughout the presentation, we'll be sharing resources in the chat. These will showcase local studies and Canadian examples, and these resources, just so you know, will be available after the presentation and on the IISD website. I also want to mention the Q&A function of this Zoom webinar. We encourage you to ask your questions in the chat. Please indicate who the question's for, if it's for a specific panelist, and we look forward to reading them throughout the webinar. You're totally welcome to ask questions throughout, and we'll give you a reminder towards the end of the presentation so that you can be sure to put them in before they close. One last note is that we will be having the next webinar in this series in the new year, likely in February 2025. And this will be on Indigenous-led natural infrastructure projects across the prairies. So feel free to scan this QR code to stay connected with us at ClimateWest on the promotion of this upcoming webinar, and be sure to sign up for the IISD newsletter that is in the chat if you scroll up. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first presenter, Robb, Associate Director of the City of Vancouver Green Infrastructure Implementation Branch. I'll stop sharing my screen and let Robb take over.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for this opportunity to present. I would like to just start by giving a land acknowledgement for where I'm at. The City of Vancouver is on the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. I'm grateful to be able to work and live in these lands, and also myself and my team take our role as implementing natural infrastructure very seriously in terms of its role of reconciliation with the First Nations. And to give you some context, so City of Vancouver, actually land area wise, it's quite small compared to a lot of other cities. Within the municipal boundaries, our land area would fit into Calgary, Edmonton, Toronto, Montreal many times over. We have a population of about 700,000, so it's small but very dense, built out. This map here shows Vancouver. We're surrounded on three sides by water: Burrard Inlet, English Bay, Fraser River. It also shows where all historic streams are. So Vancouver is situated in a temperate rainforest. We had over 40 streams, historic streams running through the city. Virtually all of them have been buried, put into pipes, with the exception of a couple segments in Still Creek towards the east side and Musqueam Creek on the west end of the city. So what does nature-based solutions, green infrastructure look like in the city of Vancouver? I'm going to use those terms interchangeably: green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. So as I said, we're built out, so we use a lot of small-scale distributed assets that we put into these big categories here: bioretention, subsurface infiltration, permeable pavement, rainwater tree trenches. And when we have one stormwater wetland asset, we're actually going to be implementing some more of these, some of these larger centralized type solutions. But in total, we have about 400 of these assets currently in the city. But to achieve our goals, these numbers will be moving into the thousands. So I've been working in this area of green infrastructure for over 20 years now. And making the business case has been part of my job throughout this whole time. Very much as it should be. Infrastructure investments should have strong business cases, but green infrastructure, being the unconventional approach, often has to go the extra mile, whereas like a business as usual type of approach, even if those investments turn out to be kind of dubious, often can get away without a strong business case. I'm going to share some of the approaches and perspectives I've taken on the business case over the years. Some of these might be like no-brainer observations, but hopefully you can find something here to take away that can help you in your work. So from the very beginning, often the task we're given is to show that the nature-based solution approach is cheaper than the business is as usual. So this figure here comes from these gray to green guides that I worked on when I was at Credit Valley Conservation. I'm going to mention a number of different resources throughout this presentation. At the end, I'll put links in the chat, so all of you have them, so you don't have to scribble anything down right now. But I think that this is an area that the gray to green guides tried to show that that the nature-based approach would be cheaper, more cost-effective than the business as usual. And the business as usual is like basically trying to do the bare minimum. So what the regulations will require. So that's often it comes down to that, just how strong the regulations are. Does it require the water quality treatment? Does it require on-site water balance or infiltration? If those aren't strong enough, then the business case often doesn't work out to be cheaper. Some of these examples here and ones that I've seen in the US are often like comparing new greenfield development, like if you're able to forego putting in a stormwater pond and you can get so many additional lots, then it can show quite a bit of cost savings. But so much has changed in this field of water management, stormwater management, rainwater management over the last 50 years. I took this figure and adapted it from the TRC design guide. I appreciate just how many goals have been added on over time, and how quickly things have changed in this field. Some of them have been codified into regulations, but a lot of them are still just aspirational. And so what we're trying to do with these business cases is, you always have to compare it to something. So comparing it to the business as usual, there's a couple ways that you can compare these scenarios. One way is, and you want to do it in an apples and apples kind of way, so showing that you're getting what additional benefits, even though maybe the cost is higher with this alternative option. One option for you is to do a qualitative kind of comparison. So basically check boxes, like this one will reduce urban heat island, this one doesn't, this one adds more native planting and green space. And I think in most cases, I think this should be acceptable. Some people are really fixated on having a cost comparison and trying to quantify those benefits, but I think for a lot of decision makers, they can appreciate that some of these benefits are less intangible. How do you put a price on like biodiversity? So I think this is an approach that we often take. But if you really wanted to quantify these benefits, there's just so many tools out there. It feels like I've seen, a new one come up or proposed like every year. But I do want to highlight this, latest and greatest one that I think is very useful and one of the most thorough approaches I've seen. So the GSI Impact Hub. They have a calculator, which unfortunately is all US based currently, and it's location based. We've played around with it and are looking at like maybe how we can use numbers, for example, from like Seattle and adapt, convert them to Canadian dollars if the assumptions are still similar. We're in talks with this group to how we can potentially expand that calculator to work in Canada as well. So I'm interested in trying to build some support for that effort. But one of the other things that this website has are these really excellent well-researched guides in each of these different areas of how to calculate and quantify the benefits. So each of these are standalone guides that you can find on this website. So we talked about the plus side, the additional things you're getting, with the nature-based solutions approach. I think I also want everyone to recognize that there's a cost to the business as usual approach that should be considered. So here I'm highlighting two of the biggest barriers we have to implementing green infrastructure in the city of Vancouver: a 3-meter offset from water mains and 5-meter offset from building foundations. So these are both the water main offset is, in our provincial guidance on water systems. The 5-meter offset is in the National Building Code. Both of these have their origins 50 years ago. So, go back to that figure I showed you. It was a different world. Nobody was even thinking about stormwater treatment or infiltration in urban areas. Wasn't even a thing then. So it's a struggle right now trying to find some compromises here with this offset. It's not to say that these offset requirements don't have any validity. There's, they're protecting against a risk, but we also have to balance it against the risk of not doing anything. So, the 3-meter offset from this drinking water system is based on a concern of stormwater pollutant intrusion into our water main systems. So many things have to go wrong before like a contamination event within a pressurized drinking water system to have to happen to actually have like a public health impact. But there is a risk there. But let me just give one example of how a cost to not allowing some of these nature-based solution approaches to go forward, in a compromising kind of way, has a cost. So just to focus on this urban heat island issue, back in 2021, we had the heat domes in British Columbia. There ultimately, in the final coroner's report, there were 117 people died in Vancouver. If you were to put this on the same scale as other like flood events, other disasters, this was one of the most deadly natural disasters in Canadian history. A lot of these deaths in Vancouver happened in areas that had high urban heat island. We have big disparities in urban heat areas in the city. So having a very low tree canopy area, high impervious cover. And the provincial coroner's report had recommendations that was not only having more, cities redoubling their efforts on urban tree canopy, but also reducing impervious area, getting more of that water into the ground. So we have a very rare, very dry summers here, super wet winters, but we have 2 to 3 months when rain can be quite rare. And they're becoming drier, and you can see it in our urban forest tree health around the city. And it's just so sad when we do get those rare summer rain events, that water just goes wasted down the gutter and away from the trees that need it. So these kind of restrictions, that 3-meter offset, which 3 meters on either side, that's a 6-meter swath through the city where we have these restrictions on green infrastructure, has some major implications in how we can address this, just specifically this urban heat island issue, but there's many more I could point to. Okay, now just shifting to another perspective that engineers and decision makers, I think, get uncomfortable with are these decentralized approaches. The traditional approach for engineers is to concentrate a problem and treat it and solve it in one place. Whereas with nature-based solutions, not always, but it's often distributed, spread out. But I mean, there's some nature-based solutions that are centralized. But for example, what we're doing in the city is quite distributed and decentralized. But I'm here to tell you that it's not so scary. We're doing this. Many other cities in the U.S. are implementing these decentralized systems. They're able to implement them. And the concern from the engineers is risk of the consequence of, which is the consequence of failure times the probability of failure. So first of all, on that consequence of failure, when we have these small distributed assets fail, it's pretty minor what happens. We have safe overflows. Water can bypass in many cases, or the flooding is quite limited. And through our own monitoring, we have monitoring reports up on our website that, again, I'll share. We're showing that actually these systems are quite reliable. There's this assumption that green infrastructure wouldn't work in Vancouver because in our wet winters, they would just fill up with water and they wouldn't drain. But what we're showing, we do sampling at sites, at a representative set of sites every year, and show that we're meeting our drawdown times of 24 hours from the surface and 72 hours from subsurface. And we have this massive atmospheric rainfall event in October. Over 3 days, we had 200 millimeters of rainfall. So this shows some of those monitoring results from that one site that, yeah, over that that system was draining even during that long event. And we had, and that one asset showed that we were actually captured that full 200 millimeter event. But how does this relate to our business case? So if we compared a centralized system investment of $15 million with a decentralized investment of $15 million, the decentralized system we can implement gradually over time. So an implementation of $500,000 a year over 30 years, you'd spend the $15 million. If we did a centralized solution, it means, taking out a loan of $15 million, implementing in the first year, and then the interest that you're paying on that over time would end up being $22 million. So it's costs more in terms of interest, but also the decentralized system allows for an adaptive management approach. And I think I'm already running out of time. Am I getting a signal? Okay. I'll just mention a couple others really quickly. Multi-goal infrastructure. There's a lot of siloed thinking in the field, like solving one problem, finding the most cost-effective solution for that one problem. But when we have multiple problems they were trying to solve at once, you might come up with a different set of solutions. In our area, we're showing nature-based solutions as meaning, multiple goals at once. And let's see. So some of our bigger projects, we do some formal business cases, but we also do a lot of little projects. So we do have an approach for doing the quick business case for small projects. We have a maximum set value that we'll pay for per area treated by green infrastructure. So we check to see if we're within that reasonable cost effectiveness range. But then we also go through like a checkbox review of like how feasible is this project and what benefits boxes can we check. And then I'll just jump right to the end so I don't take up anyone else's time.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Rob. Yeah, sorry to cut you off. Obviously, this is very rich information, and I'm the very bad news of having to keep everybody rolling. But thank you so much, and I really appreciate you, centering us in the reality of, there's a human cost to climate change and there are repercussions to if we do not act. I appreciate you mentioning that because sometimes we get lost in the sauce of like why we're doing this. And I appreciate you mentioning that. I'll ask you to stop sharing now, and then I'm going to hand over the hosting to Graham. Graham Watt is the Manager of Strategic Initiatives and Flood Recovery for the City of Grand Forks. Welcome, Graham.
Good day. Sorry, I was just having someone come through there. Can you see my screen all right?
Perfect.
Fantastic. I could have listened to you all morning, Rob. I want to see another one of your presentations. That's fantastic. I'll try to focus a little bit on storytelling this morning and share briefly a bit of a whirlwind tour through our flood mitigation and talk in particular about floodplain restoration and naturalization and how it fits into a system of flood mitigation. So we're a little bit opposite to Vancouver. We're a small municipality of about 4,100 people in a rural area in southern BC. I'll show you where in a moment, but just kind of placing myself there. We're on the unceded and traditional territories of the Syilx, Sinixt, and Secwépemc peoples. And I'm really grateful where I stand here for the ongoing relationship and development partnerships we've had with the Osoyoos Indian Band and other regional First Nations. So there's a lot of gratitude and a lot of people connected to this work. So halfway between Vancouver and the Alberta border, for those of you from outside of the country, Western North America, really, several hours drive from the West Coast. We're within the regional district of Kootenay boundary on the boundary side, which is largely a watershed of these kind of, approachable peaks and rounded foothills and gentle grasslands through the water. So the Kettle River itself is a transboundary watershed that starts up in the mountains east of the Okanagan, flows down through the states, and then comes back by Grand Forks, where it joins the Granby River, and then flows again into the states on the Columbia River at Kettle Falls. So in May of 2018, we're coming off of winter of amazing skiing, record snowpack, and then there was a heat wave that ripened the snowpack, and 40 millimeters of rain brought about our flood of record, which later on was found to be about a 200-year or 0.5% chance flood. This was a big deal in the community. There was 2 to 3.5 meters of water in large parts of Grand Forks, and there was impacts felt across the regional district from rural areas through to downtown Grand Forks. So today I'm going to focus kind of again and again on the North Ruckle neighborhood. And this is 1st Street and 2nd Street on the left here. And you can see this house in the background, one of 40 rescues that occurred during evacuation in May of 2018 there. During the flood response, there was a massive organization stood up within the Emergency Operations Center at the RDKB, and then in the operations field group that was basically taking care of everything from emergency repairs to dikes to maintaining infrastructure, getting the sandbags out, and helping the people evacuate and find shelter and respond. So within several weeks, this turned into a major 1.5-year long flood recovery effort. And just thinking to yourself, all the different sectors of a community affected by flood, and there was a pillar in our recovery organization for every aspect of it. And we co-organized it with the city, between the city of Grand Forks and the regional district of Boothby Boundary. And then we had counterparts across the province of BC parallel to every one of our local pillars. So there was support for critical infrastructure, housing, economic recovery, wellness and human needs and environmental needs, supporting from across the province and beyond. This is kind of what recovery looked like. We gathered people together and tried to figure things out together in a very short time frame. But challengingly, I guess, there was an intake for the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund just over 2 months after our flood was the expression of interest, and the final intake about 6 months after the flood. And so we had a very, very short turnaround time period to respond to the flood, develop a flood recovery program, and develop a flood mitigation program. So kind of looking at the local topography here, here's the Kettle River coming in from the west, the overall floodplains, and then the Granby River coming in from the north. Focusing again on the 2nd Street coming through the North Ruckle floodplain. This is 1951. You can see a remnant oxbow wetland connected to the Kettle River. You can see some farmland. And at this point, even though the street grid is overlaid just for comparison, there was the beginnings of a sawmill and a couple of farms in the North Ruckle neighborhood. It was not yet annexed by the city. Zoom ahead to 2015. It now hosts a major sawmill, the Rockville Industrial Plant, several other industrial properties, the city's wastewater treatment plant and lagoon system, and then formerly the North Ruckle neighborhood. Zooming out, after the flood, because we kind of knew the flood of record, we actually worked first with urban systems to develop floodplain mapping, and then associated engineering to develop flood mitigation program. And we're looking where are the damages the worst, where is the depth of water the worst. And it turns out this North Ruckle area has some of the deepest flooding within the city, and the flood construction level there is 2 to 3 meters, and in some parts over 3 meters above ground level. So in designing a system of flood mitigation, we need to think both about the natural floodplains upstream and the floodplains in the heart of the city and how it can be protected. So this is the flood mitigation scheme after design. So looking back at kind of the floodplain risks, looking forward at what's protected. Downtown, the industrial area, South Ruckle neighborhood, this whole area, but then also tracking the natural floodplains and agricultural floodplains west of town. So basically that's in a snapshot, the system. Looking again at North Ruckle from the north, here is 2nd Street. And the idea is that dikes would protect around critical infrastructure, major industry built up assets, while making room for the river in setback dikes, whether minor setbacks like at City Park or at the confluence, or major ones as in this new 10-hectare floodplain. So a couple of examples of a setback dike. You don't need the riprap. You can get away with basically connecting into the fabric of a parkland. As soon as you get close to the river, you're looking at riprap, and of course we've got pump stations and outfalls. More riprap, sheet pile dike, the confluence there in the background. This is the Kettle River flowing past 2nd Street Bridge. And this is looking down the other river, the Granby River, from the Highway 3 bridge. So if you're driving through the Southern Interior, you'll cross this bridge on the way to Castlegar. Looking along the Kettle River, this time at the North Ruckle floodplain, the Interfor Riverside Dike, and then the setback dike that traverses the North Ruckle neighborhood. There's actually a demountable flood barrier there. We won't be able to get into that. And then this is the Rockville industrial site and our wastewater treatment plant, and a new partially offset dike next to the river, but set back enough that we didn't need to disturb the entire riparian area. Only about a third of this is going to be riprap or has been riprapped. So thinking back to 2018, the North Ruckle neighborhood, the kind of impacts you see here, you can see the water is essentially up to the eaves on these houses. So council of the city and the community together really grappled, and very quickly, is it possible to actually put back the 1974 dike, or should it be removed and the floodplain naturalized? That was the decision. We could spend all day on that decision, but it had to happen very quickly. There wasn't time for complex business cases. This is the new North Ruckle dike in 2023. You can see groundwater flooding into the neighborhood that's undergoing the process of demolition. And then here's another oblique image from a drone at that point. This is logs that was stockpiled for part of the riparian restoration. During this design process, we were working with a landscape architect and planner to develop a concept for what the future area could look like. And so on the east side, a natural riparian forest, or restored riparian forest, and a new off-channel habitat. And on the west side, future park development that could have everything from natural infrastructure through to amphitheaters and other human aspects. So you can see this is where we got to in construction, a new off-channel feature, a riparian forest that's been planted. And then looking again from there after planting and before the weed eating happened in the brush in this fall. This is designed to flood every spring. This is a very low flood year this year, but you can see water has basically backflood from the outlet and come in. And there's, of course, the requisite ducks and fish and geese already coming in. During a normal kind of 1 to 2 year flood, this will be full to where the trees are around the outside. And then in a major flood, it's designed to allow flooding through it. And already this year, we saw lots of minnows and speckled bass and other little fish choosing to use the inlet and outlet features as we're going. The west side, still a bit of a canvas, but you can see the remnants of the neighborhood and the pile of concrete left over from all the basement demolitions. So thinking about costs, and this is where challenges are trying to assemble everything, but you know, I've been focused very much the last 5 years on the flood mitigation program as kind of a planner in the program, but also supporting the city in everything from, you know, the operations and maintenance of these projects, the lifecycle asset management of other infrastructure, the public works, the overall utility and how it interacts there, and then the community. And this was really in focus during recovery and also during the buyout program. The buyout program itself was a huge challenge because our senior governments limited us to have I been given the 5-minute warning? Sorry, I've just not got my clock going here. Looks like I have. I'll make this fast. The senior governments limited us to current fair market value, which is, as many people in the community know, very unfair if you've just lost massive equity in the flood. So council worked to bring some of city's own money to basically be higher than any expropriation amount would be if it went that way, to try and get a high voluntary rate of acquisition. So an additional 7.5% of fair market value, adjustments for negative equity if your house was worth less than you owed, and a floor to minimum compensation. This partially offsets some of the impacts, but ultimately the pre-flood value in a very affordable community, in an affordable part of this community, the overall loss of equity, from a median of about 177,000 pre-flood to just over 100,000 post-flood, and then a year or two later during land acquisition, ultimately with the total compensation package, people largely did not get back to the pre-flood value in their kind of financial compensation. And ultimately, they were buying into a market that was also appreciating about 40% during this period. So we could spend a lot of time on equity. We won't have time for that, but just kind of pointing out, of the overall program, about a third of it is really spent on the floodplain naturalization and natural infrastructure overall, but really largely focusing on the property acquisition. And we don't have time to get into the unit costs and that kind of thing, but we do have some data on that to share if people are interested. We also undertake to not have to demolish every house. About 16 houses got moved, the majority by the city, and that offset part of the demolition costs. And, we're certainly considering how do we look ahead to the life cycle costs of the earth berm dikes, the sheet pile flood walls, versus the naturalized floodplain, which doesn't need to get rebuilt or reacquired in 100 years. Several years ago, we did participate in the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, and I can share results and questions if folks are interested. But ultimately, the natural assets they're mandatory as part of a flood mitigation program. We may need to adjust for risk transfer to prevent the new dikes squeezing water out and causing risks elsewhere. We may have to do fish habitat offsetting. In this case, that was the large driver for doing this new channel. But there's also all those amenity, community, and ecosystem values. Do those overcome the very challenging aspects of mitigation, especially for buyouts? And when is the right time to consider the naturalized floodplain? So leaving you this kind of final thought, this is from Brent Doverstein and group in their natural hazards paper on the PARA framework. So protect, avoid, retreat, and accommodate. And I think about it a little bit in a different order. It sounds nice to say PARA, but I think ARP is probably okay. There's a hierarchy of resilience adaptation. And first, we want to avoid and not get ourselves in that place in the first place. And that's cheap. It's very cheap to avoid. There are costs to that, of course, but ultimately you're not going to be paying for recovery and response and mitigation down the road. The accommodation, what can be done in places where it's safe enough to keep a house, or other structure, what can you do to help and protect it? Retreat, of course, which we've been through, and then protecting where the assets are so great and replacing them is so challenging elsewhere that you should look at this. So ultimately, we considered those costs very quickly. I would love to see a full cost accounting of what we've done, but we're not there yet.
1 minute.
So, and I think I'm actually going to stop it right there with two pieces of art. One that was developed by Kirsten Doyle during flood recovery, and this is picturing one of the houses that she imagined would be there standing still after land acquisition on the North Rockall floodplain. It speaks to me. It speaks to the human costs of the challenges that we faced in the community. And I think that's kind of the record of displacement, the record of loss in the community is huge. And a lot of people are really worn that. Putting the other hat on, I think about not going through this again, where the flood mitigation has resulted in decades and decades and decades, hundreds of years of flood protection, where this type of event does not affect the community and where the most vulnerable neighborhood in the community does not face this again. So 150 years from now versus now, both those hats are hard to wear. But I think I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Graham. And yeah, thank you so much for including the stories of your community and the resilience that folks have been able to show in this process, and the amount of labor and work that's been done now to protect for future generations is so impactful, you know, to dovetail with the financial gain of investing now so you don't have to so much later on. I'm going to pass it on next to Michael Kapatanakis. They are a research analyst at the Institute for the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Michael, over to you.
Hello, thank you very much. I'll just share my screen. Please let me know if you can all see. So hi everyone. Today I will provide an overview of the Sustainable Asset Valuation methodology, or SAVI, as we call it at IISD, the International Institute of Sustainable Development, where I work, and how this methodology can be applied to infrastructure projects, specifically to nature-based infrastructure projects, and specifically to cities and municipalities. So I'll start with why it was developed, why this methodology was developed in the first place. So basically, SAVI was developed in response to traditional infrastructure assessments that only consider financial indicators and do not integrate economic, social, environmental parameters in decision making, especially those that go beyond the immediate scope of the project. So basically, SAVI assesses project in an integrated and systemic way, looks at infrastructure and nature-based infrastructure from a financial perspective, but also from a society perspective. So it values tangible and intangible parameters in order to do that. So SAVI has three main features. One is simulation. So it combines different modeling approaches to show the financial performance of projects under different scenarios. Then the second is valuation. We try to place a financial value in economic, social, environmental added benefits and avoided costs, for example, such as employment creation or avoided costs of air pollution, CO2 emissions, any biodiversity benefits as a result of a project, and so on. And thirdly, very importantly, we try to customize our assessments as much as possible to different regional and national contexts in order to reflect the local conditions more appropriately. Now, SAVI consists of a qualitative and a quantitative approach. First, a qualitative step is taken when we look at an infrastructure project together with partners and ideally with a wide range of stakeholders that are going to be affected by the project potentially. So in a collaborative process, we try to develop what is called a causal loop diagram. So it's a tool based on systems thinking, which is basically a mental map where we identify the different impacts and drivers of change around an infrastructure investment, and how these are interlinked. So that's the first stage here, the kind of discovering the differences in the local context. And then these maps inform the development of a quantitative model, which can be either Excel-based. Usually we use Excel, especially when we pass the model over because it's easier for everyone to use. But we also use system dynamics model, sometimes using a software called VentSim. When we take this, we take the most important indicators, and I will talk about this in the next few minutes in more detail. We integrate it into the analysis and we calculate them. These models eventually get fed with data and assumptions tailored to the local context. As I mentioned, we often develop maps with spatial modeling software to understand the changes in carbon sequestration, water runoff retention, habitat quality, for example, and so on. and we try to put a financial value to that, a monetary value, in addition to socioeconomic indicators such as employment creation or health and so on. And sometimes we also include climate data, which I will also show in a second. At the end, this results in an integrated cost-benefit analysis, which will provide information in each of these indicators and the scenarios that we include in the analysis. And at the end, we have a benefit to cost ratio, just like a conventional infrastructure assessment. Now let's look at a few examples of the different indicators or added benefit and avoided costs, as we call them, that we try to value with a sustainable asset valuation methodology. So we look at a project, and this can have impacts that can be environmental, for example, in relation to water or air pollution or any biodiversity impacts. Anything that's any impact that's social, for example, relation to employment creation or loss of traditional jobs, anything related to human health. And it can also be economic, so any contribution to economic development, property price increases, retail revenue increases, and so on. In some assessment, we also try to use EU Copernicus data to integrate climate resilience in the infrastructure analysis. So, for example, we look at climate forecasts in terms of temperature or precipitation, which is especially relevant in an urban context, where things like maintenance costs or water retention or a tree's ability to provide a cooling effect need to be considered. So we try to integrate these climate forecasts into the analysis where possible. So here I'm talking mostly about nature-based infrastructure, but it's not the only infrastructure type that SAVI can be applied to. So we can also apply it to energy or transport, water, wastewater infrastructure, buildings. And we also try to combine some of these infrastructure assets in our assessment going forward to be able to apply SAVI in an urban context where many of these infrastructure types are interlinked or intertwined. So here you can see where we have applied SAVI in many parts of the world across many different infrastructure sectors. So across Africa, Southeast Asia, some in Europe and North America as well, but mostly in developing countries. So that's an overview of the SAVI kind of methodology. Let's look at nature-based infrastructure and how it can be defined exactly and kind of the services that it provides. And then we'll look at what services it provides in an urban context. So nature-based infrastructure is basically describing areas or systems that harness nature to provide infrastructure services. So this can include natural ecosystems such as forests, mangroves, wetlands, and grasslands. But we can also look at hybrid infrastructure, which is the focus of today, which is more relevant to urban contexts, such as green roofs, urban drainage systems, and so on. So let's look at this second kind of nature-based infrastructure type, the hybrid infrastructure that is applies to cities. Let's look at some examples. So here we have, for example, urban green spaces, such as parks in a city, which lead to benefits, including increases in property prices, physical and mental health benefits, biodiversity benefits, water retention, carbon sequestration, as well as decrease in exposure to heat and exposure to air pollution. So a wide variety of benefits that we can hopefully value in our assessments, but that exist as a result of these kind of interventions. Another kind of similar type, also in an urban context, is a stormwater nature-based infrastructure, which can also lead to a lot of benefits, such as recreation, water quality benefits, again, property prices, biodiversity benefits, water retention, carbon sequestration, as well as very similarly to urban green spaces, decrease in heat and air pollution. Another type of urban nature-based infrastructure is green roofs, which also delivers a lot of these benefits that I mentioned earlier. Plus, it can also lead to energy efficiency, especially if the roofs are combined with solar PVs, for example. They can build insulation, and of course they can decrease heat and air pollution as well. Now, I know this is a lot of information. It would be really good to go through the next case study, just so we understand exactly how the SAVI is applied actually in practice. So this is a case study that we worked recently on. It's a tree planting project in Freetown, in Sierra Leone. So just to provide a context of the project, we looked at the main challenges, and there's a multitude of challenges in Freetown, including urban sprawl, expansion of informal settlements into the forests, basically. So a lot of rapid deforestation as well. There's landslides and erosion. There's extreme heat. There's flood risks from sea level rise and coastal erosion, and also flooding from heavy rainfall events, of course. What we try to achieve basically with the SAVI methodology is kind of propose some solutions that would lead to some key outcomes, such as reduced risk of floods and landslides, reduced coastal erosion, reduced urban heat stress, carbon sequestration, job creation, a better quality of the water supply, and improved air and water quality overall by these tree planting projects. Now, the indicators that we identified and we calculated in this case as a result of the tree planting project are on top of the direct costs, such as the capital expenditure, basically the tree planting costs and the maintenance costs. We also have added benefits in relation to the employment creation from the tree planting projects, property value increase, and then we have numerous avoided costs, avoided cost of air pollution, avoided cost of CO2 emissions, avoided cost of damage to infrastructure and loss of life from different natural hazards, so floods, landslides, coastal erosion. And we also try to calculate the effect of heat and the cooling effect of the trees, and how they can provide that effect in the city. So the two scenarios that we looked at, one scenario was based on the data that we received from the city of Freetown. So we collaborated with the city of Freetown on this project. They provided some data, some spatial modeling data. We took that data, which number 3.8 million trees planted by 2030. That's their ambition. And we also wanted to look at a more, slightly more ambitious scenario of 5 million trees, just to see the difference and how do the benefits compare. So here you can see how kind of the final integrated cost benefit analysis kind of looks like. So it includes all of the different indicators that we mentioned earlier. It shows a comparison of the two scenarios using a discount rate. The values are cumulative from 2024 to 2050. And what it shows in this case is that both scenarios are economically viable. And although the more ambitious scenarios of planting 5 million trees has higher cumulative net benefits by 2050, it has a slightly lower benefit to cost ratio because of the higher tree planting costs. Because 5 million trees, just in order to plant these, it's a little bit more costly, of course. Now, what we did is also look at the different indicators and the different impacts to look at what are the greatest impacts of planting these trees. So we can see that in this case, the avoided infrastructure damages as a result of the tree planting project show the highest value, followed by an employment creation and followed by avoided loss of life. We can also see that construction or tree planting costs are also high in this case, as I mentioned earlier, but the project is still economically viable. And finally, here within the avoided cost of infrastructure damages, which was the highest kind of impact, we see basically we compartmentalize the analysis by natural hazards, and we see that the highest avoided costs will be from coastal erosion, followed by flooding and sea level rise. So this is just one example. Here you can see kind of other example examples of nature-based infrastructure projects where we applied the Savvy methodology to, including mangrove restoration in Colombia, stormwater management in South Africa, lake conservation in India, forest restoration in Indonesia. Then we also have urban nature-based infrastructure such as green roofs and street trees in South Africa, and wastewater treatment in also in South Africa, tree planting project also in Ethiopia. So a multitude of different kind of nature-based infrastructure projects are around the world. And I will finish by saying that there is also a Savvy assessment on Pelly's Lake in Manitoba in Canada, which sadly I didn't work on, so that's why I didn't present that today. But I can definitely share the link in the chat if you're interested to kind of see how Savvy is applied at a context such as Pelly's Lake in Canada. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much. Let me know if you have any questions after that. I'm happy to share any links if you're interested. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. And we have had quite a few really detailed and interesting questions come through the Q&A portal. I've been monitoring them, and I also see some of our presenters have. So some folks have been able to answer people directly, and I've been looking at some common themes, and I have one that I would like to pose to all of the panelists. If you wanted to get your cameras on and come back to the webinar space. Before we get into this question, I will just mention to everyone watching that because there were a lot of questions and we're limited to the next 10 minutes or so of time. Some of these questions will be captured and replied to, so we have your contact information from registering for the webinar, and we can follow up with you as well if your question doesn't get answered. This recording will be posted after the event wraps, and so you can have access to some of these answers there too. So the first question was around creating the business case for our municipalities or our organizations that we're working within. And this is for all panelists. Both Kat, Shauna, and Bernard have had questions relating to what type of maintenance cost of the projects that you presented on, what are the types of maintenance costs that are out there? And do you or the municipalities you've worked with, how do they ensure sustained funding for maintenance? Because some folks are highlighting the fact that they have received initial funding, but then they're not sure how to keep up that. Folks also mentioned that material longevity is something that they are coming up to, and if anyone can speak to that in creating their business case. So for example, material longevity being impacted by freeze-thaw cycles, salt use, and such. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that for all the panelists. If you wanted to go, you can go in the order that we spoke. So Rob, Graham, Michael, if you have something to add.
Sure. Actually, this was maybe the last point that I glossed over in my presentation. Is like when we talk to our finance people about the thousands of assets they're going to be building, they know their heart probably pounds a little faster when we say that, because what they're thinking, yeah, that maintenance burden, and also like end of life, like these are then assets that are going to have to be replaced, and we're already at an asset replacement deficit. I think a key thing, though, that I often repeat is that we're not creating totally new assets, but we're replacing an existing asset or making an existing asset more multifunctional. So those bioretention systems, almost all of them are going into spaces that would have been landscaped anyway. So it would have been part of the city's like street horticulture program that there was already a budget attached to. Similarly with permeable pavements, it's not a brand new area of pavement, but it's taking the place of an area that would have been conventional pavement anyway. And rainwater tree trenches. So we were going to have the trees there anyway, the catch basins, the soil volumes for the street trees, whether structural soil cells, We're adding some distribution pipes. We're configuring things a little differently to now make this a more multifunctional asset. All of that said, though, like there's still like sediment accumulation that has to be removed from these locations on a regular basis. Like we can't get something for nothing. Again, going back to my first point of like everybody wants us to show that we're going to be cost less than the conventional approach, but we're trying to do more. We've shown that we, as a society, community, we have these additional goals, and there's a price to it. But there are things that we can do to try to be more cost efficient. And in terms of dedicated funding, in Vancouver right now we're using our fees people pay for their sewer and water rates for this work. I think there's some evaluation going on of some dedicated like stormwater utility fee system like other cities have, like I know Victoria or Mississauga, Kitchener, based on impervious area. So those are some directions that other municipalities have gone to pay for their stormwater maintenance, their natural infrastructure maintenance. I think New York City is similar to us in that it comes from their sewer and water rates. One of the challenges or something that we're working on right now is like making the case that some of these features, for example, in parks, we have our stormwater wetlands, and parks are doing some of the maintenance there. They struggle with their maintenance budgets, but if we can make the connection, like, okay, this work is contributing to our, watershed stormwater goals. Let's get an arrangement in place where our parks department can get some of that like stormwater fee money. I'll pass it on to Graham. Yes,
thanks, Rob. Yeah, there's lots to talk about there, but the hard infrastructure costs and even earth berm dikes require a lot of annual maintenance, mowing, inspection, structural inspection, engineering testing, etc. Before we get to eventual replacement. Whereas a floodplain forest, if it was just a floodplain forest, is just that. The constructed fish habitat offset channel itself is a bit of a special one. So maybe just focusing on that because it's for DFO in terms of our fish habitat offset, and we've got to show that it is coming towards self-functioning and replace plants over the next 5 or so years and kind of take care of that. But also we have to show that we're not stranding fish in this new channel. So you can imagine 25,000 cubic meters of fill, soil was removed from this area to create the new channel. And during a major flood, there are parts of the floodplain that had up to a meter of sand on the surface after the 2018 flood, as an example. So if we have to go in and remove a meter of sand from this off-channel wetland in order to keep its capacity and keep it open for fish, that could be $500,000 to $1 million in a given 100 to 200 year flood. So looking at what it is over a minor flood, we don't know yet because we haven't seen the sediment deposition, but it's something that we definitely have to track if we want to keep it functional as an off-channel habitat, as opposed to more of a low wet area that's filled with sand. I could probably leave it there for now.
And Michael, do you have anything to add to that? Because I also got a question specific to you.
Just something very, very quick based on our work. So I think maintenance is very different for every project that we work on, so I can't really be very specific here. But basically our understanding when we do take these assessments is based on a combination of secondary research on the specific projects and interventions to actually understand the local conditions, and also a collaboration with our partners or public authorities on the ground that provide us with data in many cases for both capital and maintenance costs of these investments. So for each particular project, they would say maintenance costs includes this, and this. we don't have that knowledge, so we kind of are based on their kind of local knowledge on this.
Yeah, thanks for that, Michael. And my question to you, because you have such a broad scope of different regions and municipalities across the globe, we're wondering if, in conducting these economic assessments, what do decision makers really appreciate in learning through Savvy? And like, can you relay any kind of aha moments or interesting exchanges with, elected representatives or public or private utilities or other government stakeholders in using these systems?
Thank you. So I think what's interesting is that decision makers are kind of presented with kind of a new way of assessing infrastructure that goes beyond kind of conventional infrastructure assessments, which only look at capital costs, maintenance costs, and revenues. So they kind of understand that there is a wide range of indirect or induced economic, social, and environmental benefits or avoided costs that a project produces. So I think that kind of leads to these aha moments of understanding that every project or every investment has a wide range of long-term benefits and avoided costs that can be costs that can be social, they can be environmental. And just to add that, I think what's a little bit more complicated and sometimes kind of surprising to these decision makers is how when we try to explain how we try to value these kind of added benefits and social environmental impacts. So how can we integrate that in the analysis and in an infrastructure assessment that's so far for a very long time was kind of happening one way, and now we're kind of expanding it and kind of including all these different indicators.
Great, thank you so much for that. I think we have time for one more question. And Tahira asked a question around standardized national building codes for green roofs. So with that kind of topic in mind, I was curious, Graham and Rob, if you can speak to, the planning and implementing natural infrastructure projects when folks are just starting out with municipalities across the country. Do you have any tips on certain standards that already exist that can help them make the case for moving some of these projects along? Or if there have been any improvements or additions made to codes that have been impacting natural infrastructure projects?
Sure, I'll speak first since you said my name first, but I don't think there's any standards for floodplain naturalization yet. There is a growing body of literature on managed retreat and even some recent work on that PICS was involved in on sort of multivariate decision making instead of simple cost benefit analysis for understanding managed retreat and how to incorporate some of the variety of social and environmental ecological impacts that go along with the normal cost benefit ratio stuff. So I'd say definitely look at there. But we definitely lacked a playbook in 2018, and I think most governments still lack a playbook for how you consider doing floodplain naturalization in a post-flood environment. So yeah, look for some more standards, I guess, on that.
So I mentioned the two standards that are a barrier to us and the city of Vancouver. We're finding it, I think, very difficult to challenge these, particularly, from a municipal level. So like we've been talking to regional organizations and to the National Research Council that does building code updates or the research or recommendation work for it. And I think they're cued into the need to address this, but it sounds like it's going to be a really long process for it. For standards out there for green infrastructure that municipalities could use, I think a lot of cities have their standards now, so definitely nobody should be starting out at square one. The link to our City of Vancouver website has all of our standards, including the CAD files to those standards, so that you could take it and adapt to fit your community. The CSA has some standards, and unfortunately, it's like behind a paywall. In BC, the MMCD, and I think I'm gonna get the Master Municipal Construction Documents, I think is the acronym. That they at least at a regional level in Vancouver, there's interest in pushing them to incorporate green infrastructure standards into the MMCD.
Okay, awesome. A lot of tabs now open, I think, on everyone's screens to follow up on those resources. Thank you, everyone, so much for participating in the webinar. We are out of time, and I just wanted to remind folks that the questions that were posed that we didn't get to will send along to some of the panelists to hopefully be able to reply to. And the recording will be posted to the IISD website in the next few days, so you can look for that. When you close out your window for this webinar, you'll be prompted to do a survey. It takes like under 5 minutes. You can give some feedback on this webinar as we build out future webinars in this series. I want to thank IISD and NIWS for helping bring this together and collaborating on this webinar with ClimateWest. And obviously, huge thank you to our panelists, Michael, Graham, and Rob, for bringing such a rich experience together and giving some really valuable reflections for everyone in the webinar. That's all we have for today, and thank you for having me steward you along this hour and 15. And take care, everyone.